Jordan Peterson went on I think it was a News 4 show. Was it in Great Britain?
Channel 4, yeah.
Channel
it literally
Channel 4.
Yeah,
and he had an interview with a woman, Kathy Newman, and they were essentially going to discuss. He put out had a book out, like 12 rules for living life or something like that. We'll somebody look it up and tell me what it is.
Yeah, I think it's 12 rules for life. I'll link to it.
Yeah, so essentially he wrote a book. He's a clinical psychologist, so he's seen and he's treated people throughout the years, and he's come up with what he thinks are 12 rules to live your life by, to lead a happy, fulfilling life. And in that book, he's got some, I guess, what people would consider controversial statements. So I think the interview was kind of supposed to be to discuss, some of the things that he wrote in the book, and she pretty much just took it toward a total, like ultra third wave feminist, social justice warrior, attack interview rather than just discussing the contents of the book and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, she basically took like 3 to 4 sentences from the book, right, and decided which were the most controversial. And to be honest, like none of them even seemed controversial, but to me, but it was like the ones that the third wave feminist or the social justice warrior would have viewed as like an insane, controversial, racist, like crazy statement or prejudice, whatever it is, and then went on and just, oh, well, in your book you say this, so you mean like it was absurd. Maybe you can give some examples of what you brought up.
So just in general, the thing that, and this is what kills me about like the media, and it just shows you how fucking lazy they are. Like, you're going to have this guy on for like a half an hour interview, an in-depth face-to-face interview. And supposedly he's a relatively controversial person. This book, I think, is number 1 or number 2 on Amazon in the US and in the UK. Like, did this woman even view? I mean, he's got hundreds of YouTube and Periscope videos. Did this woman even like look into this? This is like, me getting in the ring with Mike Tyson and being like, oh, I'm going to knock this guy out. Like, she had no idea what she was even walking into posing these questions to this guy. And it just shows you, forget her political disposition and her position, how fucking lazy of an interviewer do you have to be? Like, I think he pointed it out that like, I don't even think she read the book, and like, she doesn't even know who he is, doesn't even know his positions, because if she did, she wouldn't have even tried 1/10 of what she tried. Or if she did, then she's even dumber, because she watched all his videos, read his book, recognized how intelligent and how what he said is based in clinical psychology and, statistics and research and all that stuff. And she did it anyway. So either way, she's either lazy or stupid or both. And that's it. It's just, I would love to see somebody in the mainstream media who's not Dave Rubin, who's obviously not the mainstream media, alternative media, but I would love to see somebody, maybe Larry King needs to come back and have somebody like him on and just sit down and have a legit conversation. And listen, and some of her questions, were not terrible questions, but the way she framed them, the way she came after him, and she had no good, like, legitimate probing follow-up questions. It's so obvious she didn't want to actually understand his position or learn what he was trying to say. She was just there trying to lynch him. And like I said, the fact that he stayed so calm, so cool, he addressed her questions and concerns very precisely, very scientifically, but in a vernacular that anyone could understand. I've never seen what could have been like a disastrous confrontational interview handled so well and just completely smacked her down. And on top of it, he complimented her several times on, the fact that, she's not a pushover. She's I forget what the term that he used was.
He said she's not agreeable. And
right, she's right.
And also, he's like, well, you've made me feel very uncomfortable during this whole thing.
That's right. Right.
But he complimented her due to that. He's like, yeah, like I have no right to not. I don't have a right to feel comfortable at all times.
It was like the apex of the conversation, where there was a gotcha moment.
They were talking about how women get paid less, and he said that it was linked to a person's level of agreeableness. That if you're very agreeable, you're not good at negotiating pay. And he said to her, like, you're not very agreeable. Obviously, you're not very agreeable with me, and that has served you well in your career. Like, so even through the course of the interview, he was showing her, like, look, you are someone who doesn't fit into the stereotypical average, female, stereotype or quality set of qualities that the average female would have. So you can see you've advanced in your career because you're not agreeable, because you are confrontational, because you do push, because you did insult me, So it was a great interview. If I would highly, it was the best interview I've ever seen.
Well, what's funny too is she kept, every time that he would give some sort of analysis about, like, say, men and women or some sort of like large group, or not even analysis, he would just share the data, right? And without even like passing judgment or giving like his own analysis of it. A lot of it was merely observation that she was like objecting to.
Right.
And she kept saying like, well, I think that's a stereotype. I think that's a generalization, and then go on. And he would say, well, it's not a generalization. Like, we can look at a group of people, like, say, men and women, and understand on an individual level there are exceptions, but whatever. And then draw these broad conclusions. But then she would keep coming back to say, the gender pay gap of 9%. And so when it served her purpose, talking about, say, women broadly, as an entire gender was totally fine. And then when he tried to do it, she'd say, well, what about me? I'm going to, and he said, yeah. And some women make more money than men. We're talking about, trends. We're talking about broader structures. We're talking about, he got into this metaphor. Actually, it's not even really a metaphor. It's just an analogy, or like explaining how lobsters and how the idea of the hierarchy in humans, this idea that it's like a patriarchal social construction that we can just dismantle is, he said that it's incorrect, it's wrong, and he almost can't wrap his brain around it.
Right.
And that basically, he can trace the evolutionary origins back to before there were trees on planet Earth. And so it's not that we need to be like slaves to these things, right? And it's certainly desirable and worthwhile to try to like push the boundaries of what we can do within our biology and our minds as we sort of free ourselves from our biology. Somebody with like a vicious temper doesn't need to always like lash out violently every time he gets upset. Like, you can learn to control those things, but at the same time, we are animals and we're still biological creatures. And if you're concerned about things like purpose and happiness and what most people would call like a happy and worthwhile life, you are a biological creature and an animal, and these things matter. And you have serotonin and you have dopamine. And he said this is why when you take you give antidepressants, which stimulate neurotransmitters, to a lobster, they respond to it the same way humans do, because we're part of this evolutionary line. And it was just it came off to me like either like she had 1 foot in, 1 foot out, which is why she got exposed. Because if you were 2 feet into the radical feminist side, you don't even have this conversation, because you're going to be dismantled, and you just stick to the attacks. And this is why they just yell Nazi, and you don't negotiate, and you shut down conversation, and you deplatform. And then if you weren't, and you're just curious, then you wouldn't have these, like, every time he would make a really salient point, you would sort of like pull that thread and you would go down that path, but she wouldn't. She would sort of revert back to like the feminist talking points. So you're saying that the way that women shouldn't even bother to try to overcome them. And no, he said, no, I actually, many women have come to me in my practice, and I've taught them basically how to, compete better, to get higher and to be assertive. And so it was like he was being very genuine, and she was being very disingenuous, but also very poorly. It was just, and now it's blown up in the media, and everybody's talking about it. So,
well, aside from this interview, from all the things that I've heard Jordan Peterson speak about, the thing to me that is really, and I don't know that I've ever heard somebody convey it to me in this way, but he talks about dominance hierarchies. And he talks about how dominance, the social justice warrior or the leftist or the socialist or communist sort of dominance hierarchy paradigm is that people at the top of the dominance hierarchy are only there because they've exploited others. But if you look throughout society and throughout the animal kingdom and through evolution and stuff like that, the dominance hierarchy is mostly based on competence, a particular level of competence. Look at a hockey team. Somebody has a C on their jersey and an A on their jersey. Why? Because they're the most competent player on the team, because they're the best leader on the team, or some combination of that the people on that team decided, yes, these are the people that are going to lead us. They're at the top of the dominance hierarchy. Why? Did they exploit the goaltender or the defenseman? No, they didn't. That's not why. It's because they're competent. And you see these dominance hierarchies throughout society, throughout different animals, throughout evolution, because of competence in particular areas. And he explains that so very well. And I think when you explain that to people who just kind of see just kind of see dominance hierarchies as exploitation, and you explain it to them that way, I think it's difficult to refute that, because there are so many areas in which dominance hierarchies are completely voluntary within society, and yet we accept them, and nobody has a problem with them.
Yeah, well, it's as we said, it's best to just I think watch the video. But if you've been following along in these battles and you understand the context of the background of a conversation like this, it's really remarkable that this happened, and is definitely not good for their side. I mean, just from beginning to end. And the big gotcha moment actually was when, and again, misrepresenting, she started off saying, oh, so let's talk about you got in trouble for, refusing to call your students that are trans by, and he said, no, I didn't get in trouble for that. And that's, again, the whole point. And there's layers to this, and they want to distill it to like the lowest common, like, hateful denominator. So like the issue in Canada is that they have now passed, and at the time they were simply proposing, a hate speech law that would never hold up, or at least never has in the U.S. But in England, they certainly have these laws. You see Count Dankula right now, potentially going to jail this week for doing a Heil Hitler video with his girlfriend's pug. Very real case. They're trying to put him away for like years for it. And in Canada, it's a similar deal. And so he just said, basically, I'm not going to like follow the compelled speech laws that are being pushed by these like fanatics, these Marxists. Like, I know their game. And it's got nothing to do with like human decency. It's just, to put it into the laws as a whole. He understands these concepts, right? To put it into the law is a whole different thing. And so of course she immediately represented it as he was being like disrespectful to trans and is not supportive of them, and is quote hateful. So he corrected her on that. And then she said, well, what gives you the right to be offensive? Why is your right to be offensive overpower or trump somebody's, like a trans person's, right to not be offended? Which, I mean, there's so many problems with that sentence. But then he just right there.
The fact that somebody would even in 2018 somebody would even utter that is like on television. I mean,
but that was the gotcha moment. I mean, he was like, at that point, he basically said like, you're making me feel very uncomfortable right now. Yeah. You're really drilling down on me, blah blah blah, like with your opinion on me, and it's believe me, I'm not enjoying this, but at the same time, basically he was implying like, I came here and I agreed to talk to you, and now I have to deal with it.
He said that's what you should do. You should be prodding like this. And he said, why do you have the right to do that? And the fact that she wasn't prepared to answer that shows that how little preparation she actually did.
Yeah,
and this is, you got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No, that's not actually true. I got in trouble because I said I would not follow the compelled speech dictates of the federal and provincial government. I actually never got in trouble for not calling anyone anything.
Right.
That didn't happen.
You wouldn't follow the change of law, which was designed
not
to
once
outlaw
it was law.
Discrimination.
No. That's what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on. So and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
Except you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
It took a while. You have voluntarily come into the studio and agreed to be questioned. Mm-hmm. A trans person in your class has come to your class and said they want to be called
That's never happened. And I would call them she.
So you would. So you've kind of changed your tune on that.
No, I said that right from the beginning. What I said at the beginning was that I was not going to cede the linguistic territory to radical leftists, regardless of whether or not it was put in law. That's what I said. And then the people who came after me said, oh, you must be transphobic and you'd mistreat a student in your class. It's like, I never mistreated a student in my class. I'm not transphobic, and that isn't what I said.
Well, except you've also called...
But right there, you know, she said, there was a big pause, and she's like, oh, wait, you got me. You know, like, kind of like, oh, I'm not sure how to respond to that. Because, like, I don't know, what the hell was she expecting him to say? That's what I want to know. Like, was she all of a sudden expecting him to be like, oh, yeah, you know, like, you're right. Like, I'm offended right now. I can't go on with this conversation. Or was she expecting him to say, like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like, I should not be able to say anything if it offends somebody else. Like, what the fuck was she expecting? I don't get
it. I don't know.
Her communist programming just crashed for a moment.
Yeah, like they weren't expecting.
That's what it is. It's just a whole bunch of non-thinking nonsense that goes on. It's really completely surreal. But I'm just glad. You know, you get somebody like a Tommy Robinson or something like that, who I think is overall, you know, trying to do what he thinks is good, but he's not a debater. He's not super smart. It's
also not his real name.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Because he was in jail.
So if you threw him into like this sort of interview, it probably would have turned into a complete shit show. But like I said, Jordan Peterson, a absolute pro. It was absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, so if anyone's looking into this too, and we could try to link to it, but he's been doing a tour for his book, which actually, according to Amazon, it's in like its pre-sale stage right now, and yeah, it's his top seller. But I guess it becomes available on the 23rd of January. But he's been doing a tour in Britain, and so there's a bunch of interviews with all, you know, Channel 4 and like the 19 different BBCs. And there was another fascinating one where he starts crying, talking about the plague of young men. And they actually brought it up because they said, like, we heard that you started crying in one thing. And he's a really, really genuine, like, sincere, good person that you can tell comes through. And I
read a fascinating interview with you, and you were talking about the plight of young men and how guys really need to get their act together. You went on to say the lack of an identifiable and compelling path forward and the denialism these kids are being fed on a daily basis and undoubtedly destroying them. And that is especially true of the young men. This show, we've covered widely the fact that suicide is the biggest killer of young men under the age of 45 in this country. It goes on in that interview to say, at this point, to my astonishment, Peterson begins to weep.
Yeah, well, it says, see, now it did it to me again. Look, last night, you know, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, you know, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working, and I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, you know, they've not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives.
It's I don't know, he's a hero. He's definitely a hero. And he just got worked up because basically since he's become popular, a lot of young men, and he's seen that there's this plight of young men who don't have any encouragement, they don't have any direction in their life, for various reasons. And he's like, the fact that I'm so popular with them just because of these YouTube videos shows you how desperate they really are. And he said there's literally been like 10 to 20,000 men who have reached out to me either in person, like at some of my like speaking campaigns, or, you know, just through email or whatever, where they've said, hey, look, I just want to say thank you. I was like close to suicide. I was like on drugs. Like I was just like so depressed, had no direction, and basically just listening to you and sorting through my mind, you know, sort of like a way to develop like a confident purpose in her life and a way forward. Like that's something that's been sort of lost in this era, and it's something that he's become a leader in like providing young men with. And yeah, he was getting, and actually the BBC guy, he was being like sympathetic. It wasn't nearly as adversarial as this woman was. And he started the conversation by saying, I think it was in Britain, the number one killer of men between like 25 and 40 was suicide, which is pretty unbelievable. I mean, maybe
it's like in Japan, it's there's some ridiculous statistics.
I know Japan is
like that too.
Yeah.
I mean, Japan is absolutely out of control.
Did they have just a side note? Like, do they have a reason that they try to point to? Like in Seattle, it's cloudy all the time, and it breaks you down. Like,
well, so yeah, there's sort of a cultural thing with the samurai and seppuku,
right,
supposedly.
Is that real? Do they think that's a real?
Well,
cause?
I mean, it's partly real. You know, in Japanese culture, there's a lot about honoring your family, and it is kind of ingrained in the culture a little bit. But at the same time, like there's other cultural things that like they work a retarded amount of hours. Like they live in the office, they don't get any downtime, like they're not procreating, and like that's enough to get to like a middle-aged like young male to just want to kill themselves. So you couple those two things together, like a ridiculous amount of social stress, coupled with like a culture that says like, well, if you're not good enough and you're a disgrace to your family and country, you might as well just kill yourself. That's what you end up with, unfortunately.
And no shooting ranges.
And no shooting ranges. You need a way to let it out, man.
You know, back to the Peterson thing with him being like a guide or a mentor to people. I think a lot of it, you could just look at the fact that like a lot of young men don't grow up with fathers in their homes, and they're looking for that like guidance, that like role model type person that's just gonna. And he doesn't really make any bones about it. He's there like, just, I'm going to tell you like what you need to do to live like a good life, a responsible, like as a responsible human being. And that's kind of like the father role, right? It's like, hey dude, clean your room. That's his whole deal, right? Clean your shit up, get your life in order, you know, get up on time, go do the things you need to do, plan out what goals you want to reach, and make a plan to achieve those goals. And I think it's pretty obvious that, I mean, you know, for me personally, I mean, I'm not like lacking a father figure in my life, but there's a lot of young men who are, and I think that's why, you know, one thing that this woman pointed out on the Channel 4 show was, oh, hey, you know, your whole audience is like 80% young men. Like, does that bother you? Like, what's the deal with that? Like, there aren't any women listening to you. And, you know, he can't control who's coming to him, but there's a reason that his audience is a big amount of men. And okay, maybe he said, yeah, okay, YouTube in general is male dominated. So that might be one part of it. But the other part of it is probably just, hey, you know, they're thirsting for this kind of guidance, kind of mentorship. And he's definitely providing it. And I mean, if you don't have a dad, I mean, fuck. Jordan Peterson ain't a bad dude to follow in my mind. I mean, he's a pretty good guy.
Yeah, I've got a great dad, but listening to him is like a reminder. Like, it's very inspiring. You know, I can't speak for women, but I think most guys I know, like that feeling of like when I'm a procrastinator, I have major procrastination issues, but what gets me going more than anything is, even if it's momentary, that feeling of like purpose is very, very, very motivating.
Yeah.
And he talks about like self-gratification, like a pursuit of happiness is really like misguided, and he explains why. And just to hear like laid out, it's like very simple. It's like, yeah, that's right. That's correct. And until you like kind of hear it laid out that simply, it's I don't know, for some reason you get all these different ideas bouncing around your head. But yeah, that was frustrating by her at the beginning, like the idea that because men are pursuing him, it's like it's inherently like an evil thing. She's really playing up this narrative that which, by the way, makes her really a villain to him, because this is what he's fighting against, is this idea that men are inherently part of this evil patriarchy by virtue of just simply being men. That the fact that men are pursuing him means that he's evil too. Never mind that, maybe these men are finally, she's part of that feminist movement where their power for so long has derived from victim status. And as that transitions over into being oppressor, which happened a long time ago and is just increasing from their side, she's not able to acknowledge that there are victims from her philosophy and what she's espousing. And that's essentially what he's saying, is that a lot of these men are being left behind because of a culture that is, not caring about them, is devaluing them, is telling them that there's something wrong with them. There's some like original sin with them that they need to be constantly like groveling at the feet of women, and apologizing for constantly. So, again, definitely a hero character at the moment. And when you try to take him on, you're going to get your ass kicked, and he's not going to get upset. He's not going to call you names. He's very difficult to take down.
Yeah. I mean, and to your point about how he's, 80% of the people who view his videos and view his content and stuff are men. Over the past like 10 years, the life expectancy for middle-aged men in the U.S. and in other places in the world has actually gone down has gone up. The life expectancy has gone down. The mortality rate has gone up for the first time in like 150 years or something ridiculous like that. And specifically, if you look in the categories that are called deaths of despair, which are suicide and drug abuse. So there's like an increasing epidemic among like middle-aged men, specifically middle-aged white men. So it doesn't surprise me that, 20-something, 30-something men or young men, late teenagers, early 20s, are, looking for people like Jordan Peterson to, validate them or give them some direction. And the fact that, and this is what drives me nuts, is like, people aren't even a little curious about it, They're not even a little curious about it. They don't care the fact that in the United States, ages 25 to 34, the number one leading killer of men in America is poisonings, which is really a combination of poisonings and drug overdose, followed closely by suicide and then road traffic accidents. So there's a huge problem. 35 to 40, ages 35 to 44, poisonings are the number one killer of men in the United States, followed by suicide, then road traffic accidents, and then coronary heart disease. So there's obviously something going on here, significant amount of drug abuse and suicide. I mean, between the ages of 20 and 44, the two most likely things to kill you are suicide and poisoning. That to me is mind-boggling. That is crazy. Even more likely than road traffic accidents, getting killed in your car, which I work for a company that focuses on safety like a ridiculous amount. And they continuously tell us the most dangerous thing that you will ever do all day and every day is not walking outside in this ridiculously dangerous chemical plant. It's getting in your car and driving to work. Well, middle-aged men are more likely to die from suicide and poisoning from drug overdose than they are in a car accident. That is crazy to me. And, someone like Jordan Peterson is, presumably helping some of these people like that. Nobody cares. Well, nobody seems to care about it.
And she wanted to keep coming back to this idea of like fairness means equality of outcome. And that was like a focus for a while. And again, it's simple. And he was much more like charitable and magnanimous about it. But look, if you're so concerned with equality of outcome, all right, well, 90+% of all prison inmates are men. That's imagine if it were the other way around, what you would be hearing. So why is that?
One of the other things that he brought up too that I thought was very, very good was she talked about how like the entire economy is driven by men, which he pointed out is completely bogus because 80% of domestic spending is done by women.
Yeah, and she had a point, which was that like, well, no, I think like the structures and the hiring and, you know, within companies at the higher levels, like these are primarily men. And they later come back to that point and then they go down that road where he says, oh, yeah, that's probably kind of true. I mean, he's like, it's been about 50-50 since I've been into business, but it hasn't been centuries. And, you know, companies are free to try that. And but again, it's like it's really again, it's ideology up against facts. And you know, maybe we should move on to another topic because again, I think people are best served just at this point. We've talked longer about it than the actual interview itself. But yeah, it's like, and never mind the fact that like it or not, women give birth. Men cannot give birth to children, and you expect that to have no impact on like your career prospects.
Yeah, which by the way, like. If we were inventing a video game, right, and you wanted to give the most amazing power to one of the creatures, and one of them was I can multiply and make more of myself, women get to do that. Men don't get to do that. I tell my wife all the time, I am not a jealous person. The only thing that I've ever been jealous about is the fact that my wife gets to bear children. I don't get to. I will never understand what that is like for good or bad.
And the idea that it
and the fact that feminists and people discount that like it's a bad thing, like, oh, I've put my career on hold.
They always have
this most amazing miracle happen to me is like I cannot. It just must be. It has to be people who have never had kids. I don't believe people that are in a healthy married relationship who have kids could possibly believe any of this. I just can't fathom that.
One of the conspiracies, I think, of the patriarchy, ironically, is that the feminists tend to use like masculine like measurements for success in order to demonstrate that it exists.
Yeah.
Right. So you look at
yes. Yeah.
I mean, there's a number of them, but one of them could just be like,
yeah, if you define success by manly characteristics, then yeah, men are going to be good at them.
Right.
Let's define success as living the longest. Women win. Men die way before women do in much more horrible, tragic ways than most women do. So women win. There you go. They have a better outcome.
Why aren't there more female engineers? I don't know. Why aren't there more men, like
nurses.
Pediatricians?
Right.
You know, like it's in biology, they're kicking ass. Like we can play this game all day long. Yes. You're just cherry picking certain aspects where it just happens to be for various reasons that we can get into, why women are not misrepresented, but they're just lower for whatever reason. And it's probably maybe interesting to talk about why that is. But if there is some bias there, which, you know, there can be, then that probably should be explored. But for the most part, if you allow human beings to just sort of pursue their lives freely without any of these hangups and thoughts in their heads, if you take any two groups virtually, I think, whether they be races, whether they be genders, whether probably almost really any two arbitrary groups, they're not going to break out, the percentages equal to like the proportions in society.
Virtually nothing does in nature. Almost nothing.
Right.
Well, you know what he pointed out too? He said, look, Sweden, and I don't know if it was Sweden and Norway, but it was some Scandinavian country that had ridiculous like employment and education equality programs, like the most out of any country on the face of the planet, had one of the highest rates of underrepresentation, if you will, of men in nursing. It was like 20-1 or 15-1 or something like that, women to men in nursing. And he's like, you have all this stuff to make everything is pushed to make it equal, and it's not any more unequal than in the very place where you're pushing it the most to be equal. So
yeah, it was a devastating study that came out a few years ago in the places where they worked the hardest basically to quote correct these imbalances, and when given the opportunities, the women even more drastically went in like the stereotypical direction, and so did the men. And it's a giant refutation to the radical feminist case. Yeah, and I think it's going to go down in this like particular cultural battle in hindsight is like one of the seminal moments, because it's just so perfect. One thing that makes it striking is, and a little bit to her credit, I guess, I don't know her motivations, but usually people of her persuasion. So a couple of points. One, I watched Tim Pool's take on this, and he was basically saying, look, what she did is fine. People are coming down too hard on her. There have been some death threats, but he wasn't even talking about that. He really just meant that, you know, it's fine that she was being kind of adversarial. The problem is that she was being kind of fake adversarial and clearly had not fully researched her opponent, or not even opponent, the person that she was interviewing. But he sort of portrayed it as if she was just doing the interview and asking the questions that she should, which even he said at one point, he was like, you're just prodding in the way that you should to figure out what the hell's going on. It's very clear that she has an agenda, though, which is what Sargon was getting at, and why he was much more heated in his analysis, because she's coming at this as an activist very clearly. Right. And if she's not, then she did a bad job of seeming objective. I mean, she was just going from one talking point to another from the radical feminist side, to the point where when he was really nailing her, towards the end, where it was very clear that she was just done for, she had moved on to like ad hominem attacks, like just basically saying like, you understand why the alt-right likes you, and you're basically like appealing to the same kind of nature, and you just like to fire people up. You've been talking to him for 15 minutes. His responses are phenomenal, totally dismantled you. And your takeaway from all that, I'm supposed to believe honestly, is that you're just trying to be a provocateur, so it's it just perfectly placed, a total expert, calm, incredibly clear thinking person who's probably correct on this, and then against one of these radical feminists who is coming at it from a pure ideological point. And there's so many things you can extract from the conversation. And the main one I kept taking was, she kept going to their normal tactic. The left does not do this because of this. Because if they actually gave their opponents the opportunity to speak, all right, and I think this could probably lead into, at some point, what went on in New York City, where if they actually gave their opponents an opportunity to speak, they're going to get their asses kicked, because they don't have like the argument on their side. And so she decided for some reason to try to go up against the top guy in this particular area and actually have the conversation with him, and he fucking wiped the floor with it. And that's why you don't do it. That's why she tried falling back on the usual tropes of just saying racist and just attacking and trying to like reduce his points to like some narrative that fits the left, and he's too good. But somebody lesser than him, who would be just as correct, wouldn't be able to, reframe it and sort of put it in her place, which is, again, it's a tactic that has been very effective for the left, and it's perfectly on display. And I think if you're just looking at it from like a pure like strategy or a pure attack like perspective from their side, it was a huge failure. She shouldn't have done that. She should have just stuck to the ad hominem stuff.